Welcome to our reading lesson. Let's start by reading our learning target. I can describe the beginning, middle, and end of a story to understand the story. So it's important to know the different parts of the story. All literature, all fiction stories have these three parts: the beginning, the middle, and the end. They also all include a problem and a solution. Now, the problem might not always seem like an urgent problem, like something has to be solved or fixed, like we've read in Jasper the Farm Cat and the case of the missing mutt, where those are urgent problems that need to be fixed. It just might be something that's going on that has to be, or that's added to and changed at the end, okay? So let's start by looking at these three parts: beginning, middle, and end, and talk a little bit more about what they are. You know that the beginning is the first part. It's the start of something, okay? In a story, the beginning, the start of it, includes the characters, and it introduces the problem in our stories, okay? The middle is the part that's after the beginning, but before the end. It's that middle central part, and it's where the problem of the story or the plot of the story happens, okay? So this is where we get those details of what's happening, how the problem is growing. And then we have the end of our story. The end is the point of something being completed. So the end of our story is where our problem has been solved, okay? Now let's look at those words, problem and solved, because it's important to know what it is so that we can identify it and then be able to describe or tell more about it. So a problem is a challenge that the main character or characters face, okay? And then when it's solved, that means it's figured out. It's worked out with a correct solution to answer the problem, okay? So yesterday you read the story, The Shade Seller. This is in our Ready Reading Journal, and this was a Korean folk tale, okay? So you read The Shade Seller yesterday, and there were a couple of things that we needed to know before we began reading and understanding. Well, first we needed to know, what is a shade? What's a shade? Yeah, it keeps us out of the direct sunlight, right? So a lot of times large trees cast a shade on the ground. That's where the shadow comes through, right? When you can see that big tree on the ground, that's the shadow. But those big objects like that provide a shade. They help us to get out of that direct sunlight. Then we needed to know what a cellar was. Remember, cellar is a multiple meaning word. There's a cellar like you can go down underground where things are kept cool, or a person who sells you things is a seller. In this case, somebody tries to sell some shade, okay? We also looked at a couple of important words, like the word magnificent. Magnificent means impressively beautiful, elaborate, or extravagant, right? The new playground is magnificent. So remember we talked about the word greedy. It has that R blend at the beginning, grr. The double E that says E, greedy, means having a selfish desire for something. The dog was greedy with his bone, okay? And then we have the word tolerate, meaning to accept, to endure, or to allow something to happen without stopping it. I could not tolerate the dog barking. I couldn't endure it. I couldn't let it happen without stopping it, okay? Those three words are important to our story of the Shade Seller. Yesterday we read through this story. We're going to go ahead and read through this story again today, okay? As we're reading through it today, I want us to continue thinking about that idea of beginning, middle, and end, thinking about the problem that is happening and the way that the problem is solved, okay? All right, so go ahead and take your helper finger and put it on the first word. Tracking the words that we're reading are very important. I noticed when I was listening to some of you read on our one-to-one conferences that we were skipping lines and skipping things. we have to track in order to make sure that we're reading every single word, because if we leave parts out, then we're not going to understand what we're reading, okay? So when I ask for you to put your helper finger on the word and track along, please make sure that you're doing that. It's to help you, okay? Helper finger on the first word in paragraph number 1. Ready? Read. A magnificent shade tree once grew near the house of a greedy merchant. Every day the merchant sat under the tree. One warm day, a young man stopped to rest under the tree too. "Ho!" cried the merchant. What do you think you're doing sitting in my shade?" "The tree belongs to everyone," he said. "It is mine. However, I am willing to sell you the shade," declared the merchant. "No one owns shade," said the young man. "I own the tree, therefore I own the shade," replied the merchant. The young man paid the greedy merchant. As the hours passed, the shade moved with the sun. So think about what's happening in the beginning here. In the beginning, we have the young man who comes to sit in the merchant's shade. But the merchant says that the young man has to buy the shade. So the young man bought the shade in order to be able to enjoy it. So the problem is that the merchant made the traveler, the young man, buy the shade. Let's see in the middle how that problem grows. Okay? All right, now we're on paragraph number 9. Put your finger on the first word in paragraph number 9. Ready? Read. When the shade moved into the merchant's yard, the young man did too. The merchant frowned. Then the shade moved into the merchant's porch. The young man followed. The merchant gritted his teeth. Finally, the shade moved right into the merchant's magnificent house. The young man moved right in with it. This was more than the merchant could tolerate. So what's happening? When the shade moves, the young man moves. How does the merchant react to that? He's getting angry, isn't he? Okay. Paragraph number 12. Ready? Read. "What are you doing? What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. "I'm simply following my shade," said the young man. The young man had indeed bought the shade. The next day, the young man returned and brought his relatives. His children laughed and played in the shade. His uncles and cousins sang and danced. The merchant could hardly hear himself think. Finally, he shouted, "I want to buy back my shade." "You sold it to me, and I intend to keep it," the young man shouted back. The merchant retreated to his house in frustration. So what's happening here in the middle? We know that the problem is that the young man had to buy that shade from the merchant. How does that problem grow? What's happening in the middle? Yes, so because the young man bought the shade, he moved with the shade, didn't he? Every time he moved with the shade, it got closer and closer to the merchant's house, and the merchant did not like it, did he? All right, let's read what happens at the end and see how our problem is solved. Paragraph number 17. Soon after that, the merchant moved far away. The young man moved into the magnificent house, and to this day, travelers are welcome to share the shade. So what happened at the end? The merchant moved, and the traveler moved into his house and shares the shade, right? All right, so now let's go ahead and let's go over to the questions. If you have not answered the questions on page 266, 267, or 268, please make sure that you pause the video, answer those questions, and then you may unpause the video to check, okay? All right, so we're going to start with question number 1. Question number 1, okay? All right, question number 1 says, what do we learn about the merchant at the beginning of the story? He often argues with people who sit in his yard. He doesn't like it when people sing and dance. He sits under the tree near his house every day. He doesn't know what that the shade moves with the sun. So what do we learn about the merchant at the beginning of the story? What do we learn? Do we learn that he argues with people who sit in his yard? He didn't really argue with the man, did he? He just told him that he had to buy it. So that one is not it. A is not correct. B, he doesn't like it when people sing and dance. That doesn't happen at the beginning, does it? That happens at the end. So B is not correct. C, he sits under the tree near his house every day. Did that happen in the beginning? I remember him. That's what started this story, right? It says, every day in paragraph number 1, every day the merchant sat under the tree. So we're going to put a star beside that one to make sure that there's not another choice that could be a better answer. D, he doesn't know that shade moves with the sun. Now, why that's true, that shade moves with the sun, that's not supported in our story. So that one is not true. We have to use those facts from the story. So we learn at the beginning that the merchant sits under the tree near his house every day. Okay? All right, question 2 has 2 parts. First answer part A, then answer part B. Part A, when does the problem begin? Okay? When does the problem begin? When the merchant finds the young man sitting where the merchant likes to sit. When the young man says that no one owns shade. When the merchant yells at the young man for moving into his house. D, when the young man brings his relatives to the merchant's house. This one has a lot of details that happened in the story, but we have to find out the answer to the question. When does the problem begin? We know that the problem happens at the beginning of the story, right? So we have to find out which detail happens at the beginning. Okay? A, when the merchant finds the young man sitting where the merchant likes to sit. Did that happen at the beginning? Yeah, that happened, and then the rest of the story happened after that, right? That's when the merchant made the man buy the shade. So we're going to put a star beside that because that is something that happened at the beginning, but we need to make sure that there's not another choice that could answer the question better. B, when the young man says that no one owns shade. Is that where the problem starts? Or did that happen after the problem? That happened after the problem, right? The merchant said that he owned the shade, and then the man said, no, nobody does. So that can't be it. That happened after. C, when the merchant yells at the young man for moving into his house. That's a detail that happened at the end of the story, not the beginning. D, when the young man brings his relatives to the merchant's house. That happened in the middle of the story and not the beginning. So the problem begins when the merchant finds the young man sitting where the merchant likes to sit, right? That's happened in paragraph 2 and 3, so we can go back and look there. One warm day, a young man stopped to rest under the tree too. Oh, cried the merchant, what do you think you're doing sitting in my shade? Okay? All right, and then B, write the sentence that tells what the merchant wants the young man to do in order to sit in the shade. So now that the merchant has found the man sitting in the shade, what does he make him do? All right, well, let's go back to paragraph number 4. The tree belongs to everyone, he said. It's mine. However, I'm willing to sell you the shade, declared the merchant. Okay, so when the merchant finds the man sitting under the tree, in order for the young man to sit under the tree, the merchant tells him that he has to buy the shade. Okay? All right, now let's go to number 3. At the beginning of the story, the author says that the merchant is greedy. Find 2 details in the story that show that the merchant is greedy. Write them on the lines below. Remember, greedy means selfish. They want it all to themselves. They don't want to have to share something, right? Okay, so find 2 details from the story that let us know that he is greedy. Well, one of them is when he makes the man buy the shade, right? That's one detail. Okay. What's another time that shows that the merchant is greedy? Yeah, he says that he owns the tree, which means he owns the shade. So the man, well, we'll say the merchant, says he owns the tree and the shade. He's not willing to share anything, is he? We kind of got those out of order. That's okay. The merchant says he owns the tree and the shade, and then he makes the man buy it. But those are two details that support that the man is greedy. Number 4, the young man brings his family to the house. Read the sentence that tells what the merchant did. The merchant retreated to his house in frustration. What does retreated to mean in this context? So we have to use our context clues to figure out the meaning of this word. Went away from, went back inside, looked behind, tore down. The merchant retreated to his house in frustration. So I see the words to his house. So I know that he didn't tear his house. He didn't look behind his house. So I know that he's doing something to his house, right? Did he go away from his house or did he go into his house? Well, that prefix re means again. And we know that he didn't leave. He went to the house. So he went back inside. The merchant went back inside his house in frustration. Remember, when you use context clues, when you find that meaning, you can replace that word with the meaning in the sentence and it should still make sense, okay? All right, now we're going to go and we're going to answer question number 5. All right, question number 5. Okay? Question number 5 is basically wanting us to identify the beginning, the middle, and the end because we need to answer the question, how does the merchant's problem change during the story? Okay? So below the details from the shade seller, write them in the part of the chart where they best fit. The family moves into the house for good. The young man follows the shade into the house. The merchant sells his shade to the young man. The young man brings his family to enjoy the shade. A young man stops to rest under a tree. The merchant moves away. So we have to take those details and we have to organize them in the beginning, the middle, and the end to answer the question, how does the merchant's problem change during the story? Because we know it doesn't stay the same. So what happens at the beginning of the story? The young man comes to rest under the tree. All right, what else happens in the beginning? The merchant sells the shade to the man, doesn't he? I don't think I wrote small enough. Okay. All right, what happens in the middle? How does our problem grow? The merchant sells the shade to the man, so now what happens? When the shade moves, what does the man do? The man moves. So the man follows the shade. Okay? Then the young man brings more people. He brings his family, doesn't he? That really infuriated the merchant, didn't it? So what happened at the end? The merchant moved away and the family moved into the house, didn't they? Okay? Now that we know what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end, this is where we're going to have to write to answer the question. Number 6. How did the merchant's problem change during the story? Explain what happened and whether the problem was ever solved. Okay? So we're not thinking about the young man's problem. We're thinking about the merchant's problem. Okay? So remember, he made the man buy the shade. He sold the shade to the man. Then the man follows the shade. That was a problem, wasn't it? So at the beginning, the merchant's problem was that he had to was that someone was in his shade. Okay? Now, in the middle, did his problem of that person being in his shade get better? Or did the problem get worse? It got worse, didn't it? So after he sold the shade, the problem got worse. Because the man moved with the shade. All right, after the man was moving with the shade, did the problem ever get better or did it keep getting worse? It kept getting worse. So the problem continued to get worse. So much worse that the man moved away. Well, the merchant. Okay, let's go back and read it. How did the merchant's problem change during the story? At the beginning, the merchant's problem was that someone was in his shade. After he sold the shade, the problem got worse because the man moved with the shade. The problem continued to get worse, so much worse, that the merchant had to move. All right, guys, so in this story, we found the beginning, the middle, and the end. We found that in this problem, in this story, that the merchant's problem got worse, while the young man had a different view of that problem, didn't he? It got better for the young man as it got worse for the greedy merchant. All right, so let's reflect back on our learning target. I can describe the beginning, middle, and end of a story to understand the story. When you really sit down and focus on the beginning and the problem, how the problem grows in the middle, and then how the problem is solved in the end, does it help you better understand what you're reading? I encourage you to take this skill and use it in your independent reading to help you better understand what it is that you're reading.